And now we are even more honored to have Jeannette Wing here as our first keynote speaker. So, Jeannette, if you would like to step on the stage. Very dramatic. We should have some dramatic music. We need a shark music. Oh, yeah, of course. So there you go. Probably many of you have heard about Jeannette Wing before. So she was the person who in 2006 wrote this piece in the Communication ACM arguing that computational thinking should be the fourth basic skill after reading, writing, and arithmetic, which has basically, I would argue, started a lot of these discussions and a lot of the interest around the world in how can we understand. I mean, there's a lot of question about what is computational thinking, how can we teach it, how can we evaluate it, how can we introduce it into the different national curricula. We are very happy to have you here, and she's currently the Avanessian Director of Data Science Institute at the Columbia University in New York, so you're moving back to your home city, if I understood things correctly. But previously has been the Vice President for Microsoft Research, has been at Carnegie Mellon University, and also been involved with the National Science Foundation in the Computer Science Education Initiative there. So please enlighten us.
I wish I could do what Fredrik did and show my slides in English and speak in Swedish. But I can't do that, and you wouldn't want me to. So thank you very much for having me at this to let me talk about computational thinking. I started 10 years ago with my grand vision that computational thinking will be a fundamental skill used by everyone by the middle of the 21st century. This is 2007 now, and I gave myself a lot of time by the middle of the 21st century for this vision to be realized. And I will tell you more about how I feel 10 years later. I meant, just as Fredrik said, that computational thinking would be as fundamental as reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I also knew that computing was going to help the spread of computational thinking. So it's quite an incestuous goal in that way. In research already, I think it's given now that every single field in conducting research uses computing in one way or the other, whether it's science and engineering or even arts and humanities. 10 years ago, I don't think that was a given. I think 10 years ago, when I was at the National Science Foundation, I was in charge of computer science research and education for the entire country. I was still trying to convince my colleagues at the National Science Foundation in biology and geosciences, math and physical sciences, and so on, that computational thinking was going to be fairly routine for their scientists and engineers. And in fact, at NSF 10 years ago, we started a program called Cyber-Enabled Discovery and Innovation. And that program 10 years ago was essentially computational thinking for scientists and engineers who are doing research. And, you know, again, 10 years later, it's just a given. So I almost don't have to argue this point anymore, although I will give you some stories later in my talk, which I hope will make the point. So that's research. In terms of education, you know, if research is going to have it and beyond science and engineering, that simply means that graduate students are going to be learning computational thinking par for the course. And so that's the graduate school level. Then, of course, we go lower to the undergraduate level, and that's where I focused a lot of my energy in the beginning. In fact, my 2007 paper really, actually it was 2006, was it? Yeah, 2006, 11 years ago. 2006, I wrote that paper, and I can have an offline discussion with all of you as to why in 2006 I felt obligated to publish that paper. I wrote that paper primarily for the computer science community to say, let's stop teaching Introduction to Computer Science to our freshmen that was essentially Introduction to Java Programming. And I said, if non-computer science majors take that course, they'll be turned off to computer science. We are not doing a service to the field by saying to the world, computer science equals Java programming. And so one of the reasons I wrote that paper was to basically say we have a lot more to offer as computer scientists to the ways in which we solve problems than writing Java programs. So that was the undergraduate level. To my gratification and complete surprise, in the last 10 years, a lot of the energy has actually gone into the K through 12 space, what you call here schools, I believe. And I'm going to speak a lot more about that later in my talk, because I have been watching in the past 11 years what has happened, and I'd like to share with you what I understand is going on in different countries, including the United States. I'm really glad to see that Sweden is coordinating their efforts so that you can have essentially a national, let's call it, curriculum. I really commend that. So congratulations on that. Okay, so yes, it was 11 years ago, more than 11 years ago when I wrote that paper. And it's amazing to me, this is another thing as academics can really, really appreciate, and that is the power of the written word. This is a 3-page article. I'm probably more known for this than I am for some of my research, but that's okay. I've certainly been quite influential with my 3-page article, so that's a really gratifying feeling. Okay, so now the million-dollar question or the billion-dollar question is, what is computational thinking? And of course, when I published that article, I didn't have a very succinct answer. In fact, this is hardly succinct either. But I actually remember the last day right before the editor said, okay, this is all we get. This is your last chance now. Could you please just give me a 1-sentence definition of computational thinking? And I said, no, I can't actually. And he said, well, it would be better if you could. I said, yeah, I know. I completely agree with you, but I can't. And he said, okay, we'll just publish it anyway. And it's a good thing that we did, because it took a while for my colleagues in computer science and I to sort of massage the idea and figure out what we really mean. And this definition I have now is something that I've been using for a few years now, and it came after many conversations with Al Aho, who many of you know as the Aho, Hopcroft, and Ullman Aho, Jan Cooney at the National Science Foundation, who was my program director, who helped promote computational thinking to K through 12 students in the United States, and Larry Snyder at the University of Washington. So it was a few years, lots of iterations, lots of community reaction, but this is the definition that I like the best. And if you're a computer scientist, you'll understand why some of these words appear as they do, because it's somewhat technical. So computational thinking is the thought processes involved in formulating a problem and expressing its solution in such a way that a computer, human or machine, can effectively carry out. So let me unpack this. First of all, it's the thought processes. And by that, I really, really mean it's the human beings, the people who is doing the computational thinking. It's not the machine. Many people mistook what I said by computational thinking to mean getting, they said getting machines to think like humans or something like that. That's not what I mean. And I didn't mean getting humans to think like machines either. I mean humans to think like humans, but using computational approaches. So what am I mean by the formulating a problem and expressing a solution? That's problem solving. But what's interesting about problem solving here is that part of the thinking process is actually to figure out how to state the problem. Because if you state the problems in certain ways, then it will lend itself to more efficient solutions than if you state it in other ways. So that's actually half the battle. And it's unlike many other fields where the problem is kind of known or it's stated for you, and then you have to just go figure out a solution. So half the battle here is actually formulating the problem. The part about expressing the solution, expressing is quite technical here. As we know, one way that we express solutions in computer science is to write a program. That makes the solution concrete. It makes it executable, and it makes it so that you can animate it, visualize it, and observe the behavior. So expressing the solution is akin to writing something down, writing an expression, and it could be a high-level language like a specification language, but more usually, it would be in a programming language. So expressing a solution. And there could be many solutions to a problem, as you know, not just one solution. In such a way that a computer, and now I'm being agnostic as to whether the computer is a human. I mean, after all, humans compute. We may be better at some tasks than machines. For instance, a lot of the AI tasks that we are now solving with machines, we always thought that machines would never catch up, but now they are. But humans are still better at some things than machines. Or it could be that, in fact, machines are a lot better at some tasks than we are. They're a lot better than us in adding up numbers really, really quickly, for instance. But more interestingly, I wanted to leave this, human or machine open in that today we often talk about humans and machines working together to solve problems that neither can solve alone. Networks of humans and machines. Crowdsourcing is a simple example of that. So this is a wave right now that is, actually it's already 10 years old, that has been hitting the computer science research community. And so I want to include that kind of computer too, because of the ability to solve problems that neither can solve alone. And then can effectively carry out. Effectively is quite key here. We need a solution, if you will, that's going to solve the problem in a reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, it's useless. So this is why we do talk about the complexity of an algorithm in solving a problem. Okay, so enough with that. I just wanted to get that off my chest. Okay, so let me talk. Another thing, the central part of that definition is about thought processes. And one of the key thought processes that I think helps distinguish computational thinking from other kinds of thinking, but not in a unique way, is the notion of abstraction. And let me just walk through that. First of all, I always think of computer science as the automation of abstractions. And that's a very poetic way of saying what computer science is. But what that means is we think of these abstractions that we then implement on some machine, usually on some computer, usually a machine. And philosophically, I really mean for computational thinking to really complement and combine mathematical engineering thinking. I mean, after all science and engineering and mathematics uses abstraction, but it's usually the focus of in math or engineering or science is that you stay at the same level of abstraction. So for instance, in biology, you're a cellular biologist, or you're a molecular biologist, or you're a population geneticist. And you usually stay at that level of abstraction and not go up and down the stack. In computer science, we go up and down the stack all the time. Moreover, even when we're talking about 2 layers of abstraction, that's what's important to us is not so much the bottom layer or the top layer, but the interaction, the relationship between the two. So when we build a compiler, we're talking about expressing a solution to a problem in one language, and then writing a translation, that's the relationship, writing a translation of that program into a lower level program, say assembly. And we care as much about that translator, the compiler, as we do about the source program and the target program. And so, and whole, decades of research in computer science focus on just this relationship. Of course, they also focus on these languages, but that's just an example. If you think about the network stack, TCP/IP, and how important that protocol is to the entire internet, you've got TCP/IP is sort of the neck of the internet, and tons of many devices below that have come about through decades of technology advances and tons of applications above that, again, have come about through decades of advances. But interestingly, TCP/IP has been there forever and has held the internet together through the decades of advances of devices and through the advances of applications. That's pretty amazing. So this is again, figuring out in this particular case the right level of abstraction to define this network protocol such that it could carry through all these advances that we couldn't even foresee. So this is quite ingenious of the original internet designers. So anyway, computational thinking draws on math as its foundations, as all science and engineering disciplines draw on mathematics as their foundation. So computer science is no different. But in computer science, we are constrained by the physics of the underlying machine. So my laptop has finite memory and finite processing capability. And in mathematics, you don't have to worry about being constrained by finite resources. In computational thinking draws on engineering, since our systems actually interact with the real world. So we also have to worry about the systems that we build and the interactions they have with the real world. Just like the bridge can't fall down, the building has to stay up, and all the engineering of physical artifacts obviously have to interact with the real world and Mother Nature, people, and so on, and so do our software artifacts. But in computer science, we can do one thing that no other science and engineering discipline really owns, and that is for one thing that is special to computer science. What is that? You got a hint of that from the second speaker this morning. Only because there's only one part of that word I really understand, that name. Software! In software, you can build anything. You can build virtual worlds that defy the laws of physics, defy the laws of nature. These little cute agents, they die and then come back alive. That's very normal for the games that our children play. And they're flying around. And so with software, you can do anything. You are truly limited only by your own imagination, by your own creativity. And that's why computer science and computing more generally is extremely powerful, and it's a very, very creative discipline, because it's whatever you can think of in your head and then realize in some machine. That's unlike in the physical world, where you might think of something, but it's just impossible, provably impossible to build physically. Okay, so when I talk about computational thinking, I mean the ideas and not the hardware, not the software. I really mean these sort of abstract concepts like abstraction. And I do mean that it's for everyone, everywhere. So just to be a little more concrete, here's a list of computational thinking concepts that I always like to think about, but I'm not really arguing that every single student needs to know all these concepts. What I am arguing is that there's some concepts that every single student should know. And I think we can agree on some of them. Everyone should know what an algorithm is, what state machines are, what invariants are. And there are other kinds of things that are on this list that will be very familiar to computer scientists in the audience. This is kind of the bread and butter curriculum that we teach our students who are majoring in computer science. And there's some things probably missing that I haven't updated this slide yet. But the point is not so much, here are some classes of computational concepts. The point is to distinguish what I mean by computational thinking from computer literacy. Computer literacy is knowing how to use current technological tools like Word and Excel and PowerPoint. And also I want to distinguish computational concepts or computational thinking from computer programming. I've already made this point, but I really mean that computational thinking is not the same thing as computer programming. It's not the same thing as learning Python or learning Java or learning your favorite programming language. Of course, when you're learning those languages and you're actually writing code in those languages, you are using computational thinking concepts. So I hope that's clear. Okay, so now what I wanted to do very quickly is just go through a few examples of how computational thinking is already being used in other disciplines. And some of this will be very familiar to you, and I'm not going to give examples for every single discipline. I'm going to flash lots of slides up and just talk about a couple. So one discipline, I usually start with this one discipline that has been affected and influenced already by many computational methods and models and tools and languages. What one discipline do you think I have in mind? I'm going to be asking questions throughout my talk. You have to just, shout out an answer. Don't be shy. No one's wrong in this class. Thank you very much. Biology. So, and now, okay, here's my second. Thank you. What is the one breakthrough in biology where the biologist thought maybe those computer scientists have something to add to my repertoire of thinking skills? Who said that? Fred, or you saw my slides before? All right. It was the shotgun algorithm that expedited the sequencing of the DNA genome, the human genome, that was around 1999-2000, that really got the biologists to sit up straight, look at us computer scientists and say, hey, maybe you have something there. Now, of course, it wasn't just the algorithm that helped expedite the sequencing. It was also computer infrastructure, as Frederick was mentioning, arrays and arrays of compute infrastructure that allowed things to happen in parallel. But people really do credit the computer scientists, Eugene Myers, who came up with this along with his colleagues, really credit this algorithm for making a difference. And then since then, of course, that excited the computer science community. A whole bunch of people jumped on board and said, okay, we're now computational biologists, and we're going to discover new biologists using our computational tools. And it was many, many years before computer scientists and biologists really were able to talk together in the same language and to be able to help each other advance both biology and computer science. And this is an ongoing dialogue. But throughout the years, many different computational methods, tools, techniques, languages, and approaches have been used with computer scientists and biologists working together. And again, the idea is to really discover new biology with these computational tools. But along the way, many of the computational tools that we know and the languages that know had to invent new computer science in order to address the problem in biology. I think what's common here, and I was careful to choose these particular examples, what's common in these examples is that there's this, and this is why computer scientists thought they had something, or think we still have something to offer the biologists, and that is, in biology, one of the hardest things in biology is to model the dynamics of biological processes. So first you have to model whatever level you're thinking about, cellular, molecular, protein level, and you're modeling the dynamics of these individual molecules or proteins. And then, of course, more interestingly, it's the interactions among these different proteins or molecules or cells or organisms or populations and so on. And in computer science, this is what we do in operating systems. We model the interactions of concurrent processes, or now distributed processes. And we have models for that. We know how to simulate that, we know how to program them, we know how to observe their behavior, and we know how to formally reason about the interaction of those different concurrent and or distributed processes. We know how to build fairly complex digital systems that have very complex interactions. And we know how to do verification on those kinds of processes given a high-level specification and so on. So the insight that computer scientists are trying to bring to the table is that models and languages for expressing computational processes are good for expressing the dynamics of biological processes. This is what underlies all of this. And so let me give you one example. And my examples, I'm still new to Columbia, so my examples are going to come from Microsoft Research, where I was for almost 5 years before I came back to academia. And this is work done at Microsoft Research in Cambridge by Sarah Jane Dunn and her colleagues. And the idea is really to model stem cells to be able to understand basically what is the essence of a stem cell that will preserve a property called pluripotency. So let me just give you I'm hardly a biologist, so you're going to understand exactly what I say, because what I say is hardly deep, but I hope understandable. And stem cells have two properties that distinguish themselves. One is this property is self-renewing. They divide indefinitely. And the other property is really it's nature's mystery, and this is pluripotency. The idea that from a stem cell is going to eventually turn into what's called an adult cell. It'll eventually turn into a liver cell. It'll eventually turn into a lung cell. It'll eventually turn into a skin cell. And it's just amazing. Mother Nature is amazing. This stem cell, this plain old little cell, is pluripotent in that it can take on many forms, and we don't know how that happens. That's the mystery. We don't know how that stem cell turns into a lung cell or a skin cell. What is interesting, and this is something I didn't know until I started reading her papers, is that we can actually reprogram adult cells into a stem cell. So that's pretty amazing, because if we know how to do that, then you can imagine then once we can do that, then we have a whole bunch of stem cells. And if we can only direct that stem cell to turn into a cell we want, then we can think about tissue generation and maybe organ replacement and so on. So anyway, this is the context. We would like to understand stem cells. And the work that Sarah Jane Dunn did was to look at mouse stem cells. And it's known that this is a cell. It's known that there are 3 different signals that only 2 out of 3 signals sent into the stem cell will allow the stem cell to retain this pluripotency property. So and then this is a typical gene expression map. So if you are given the combination of 2 of the 3 or 3 of these signals, then you can see how strongly pairs of genes express themselves. And so if you look at this as a computer scientist, what you see is not so much a biological gene expression map, but what you see is what's called a Boolean network. You see a state machine. And here you have genes which are either on or off, and you've got signals that through various combinations turn the genes on or off. And this gene expression map basically says for a dotted black line between 2 of these genes, it says there's a positive reaction or interaction between these 2 genes depending on the signals in the input signals. And the red dotted lines means there's an inhibitory interaction. So it's just, as I said, it's a Boolean network. You've got 0s and 1s along these lines, and you've got on or off for the nodes. You've got 0s and 1s coming in, and then you basically can potentially write out all the combinations. this is a nice succinct way of expressing all those combinations. So once you do that kind of transformation of, or interpretation of what biologists do naturally to something that computer scientists can manipulate and reason about, then you're golden. And so now that we're in computer science land, then we can take this, feed it to our model checker or our theorem prover or anything that knows how to reason about Boolean circuits and prove all sorts of interesting properties. So that's exactly what Sarah Jane did. Now, the aha here is, so computer scientists, when faced with this, we think, okay, yeah, we know how to deal with that. A biologist would never fathom to think that they could reason about such a complicated set of behaviors because of the combinatorics. We're talking about 10 to the 43 Boolean networks that this particular graph represents. And a biologist might think, oh my God, I have to evaluate each one of those, and that was going to take, more than my lifetime. But in computer science, we know how to deal with large things. And it's through our data representations and our data structures and our algorithms and our tools and so on. In this particular case, coming from my own area of research, which is formal methods, there are these satisfiability modulo theories called SMT solvers that easily handle 10 to the 43, a data structure that represents 10 to the 43 Boolean networks. And so basically, you can feed this into a SAT solver, and Z3 is the workhorse SAT solver of today. That's also an invention by Microsoft Research. I'm putting in a plug for my former life. And what Sarah Jane Dunn did was basically collapse the 10 to the 43 network, set of networks into something smaller, and said, and what she did for her constraints for the SMT solver was she drew from the literature of all experiments done on this stem cell and used each experimental result as a constraint on the SAT solver. And so what results is this particular smaller Boolean network that it represents essentially what has to be present for every single one of those experimental observations to hold. So this is what she was able to do, and she calls this the essential program governing naive pluripotency. This was the first time ever that this kind of result was even pursued, and it was published in Science, as I mentioned. And given this sort of essential program for any mouse stem cell, then you can ask all sorts of interesting questions. It leads to new kinds of experiments, and those are also led to some large number of predictions that the biologists were very interested in. So this is, I deliberately picked this particular example in biology because, of course, I'm going to get to later the kind of the big data wave that's happening now, machine learning and so on. And this does not use machine learning. It does not use big data in any phenomenal way. It's core computer science. It's a kind of computational thinking that most scientists and engineers are not exposed to, SAT solving, for instance. So this is a kind of thing that we could imagine, in teaching computer science to our students at all levels, a kind of tool or technique or thinking, logical thinking, the notion of specification, invariance, verification, reasoning, those kinds of concepts that I'm talking about, that's all behind this kind of research. Okay. So now I basically was giving you one example of where one discipline, biology, has been and is being influenced by many computational methods, and I picked on SAT solving. I picked on theorem proving, model checking, formal methods, verification, specification as that area of computational thinking that's spoke specifically to this biology problem. But now let me turn it around and say, what one computational method has had tremendous influence and impact on multiple disciplines. This is another question, and I already gave you the answer if you were listening carefully. Thank you, machine learning. And machine learning has transformed the field of statistics. I'm now wearing my computer science biased hat here. I think the statisticians in the audience would cringe at that statement. But certainly at Carnegie Mellon, another former life of mine, we many years ago created a machine learning department. It's probably the only one in the world, but okay, that's Carnegie Mellon for you. And it was a blend of the computer scientists and statisticians on campus who are off in some other school called Humanities and Social Sciences, coming together, creating this new department, which actually lives in the School of Computer Science. And this is very foresightful because this is way before the days of big data and deep learning. This is still in the days of support vector machines and kind of pretty standard supervised learning. And I remember, I'd say now 15 years ago, a student who was getting a PhD in computer science came to me for advice. At that time, I was running the PhD program in computer science at Carnegie Mellon, and he got a job offer from a very big, famous university, very strong in science and engineering. And the job offer, actually, he got 2 job offers from the same university. One job offer was from the computer science department, and the second job offer was from the statistics department. Now, at this big, famous science and engineering university, the statistics department was actually stronger than the computer science department. And he was a little hesitant to go to the computer science department. But he knew that if he went to the statistics department, he would be the one to lead the change of that department into the new era of, machine learning. And he did go to the statistics department, and it was really no regrets looking back. And that was already 15 years ago, where statistics was waking up to, hey, those computer scientists are taking some of our formulas and doing something interesting with them. And now the rest is history. So machine learning in the sciences has made new discoveries in astronomy, in medicine, in predicting tornadoes in meteorology, doing a lot of interesting things in neurosciences because of reading lots and lots of fMRI data, which are already pretty coarse-grained in terms of understanding the brain. Machine learning everywhere. Machine learning is what detects fraud in our credit card usage. They spit out coupons for us in the supermarkets. This is in the US. I don't know if in Sweden you get those annoying coupons, but we get them all the time. Machine learning, of course, is used in the financial industry for good or bad. We've learned to be cautious about that. It's used in everything we do in a daily life in terms of recommending what movies to watch, what books to buy, what music to listen to. And it's even used right now in sports by gathering up lots and lots of video of professional players. Coaches now use that video to train their own students. And this is now, it's just common practice. When, 8 or 10 years ago, I was talking about the use of machine learning in sports. That was quite novel. And now I have colleagues in academia who get money from the National League of Baseball and all sorts of professional sports organizations because they know that they need to do data analytics. And then, of course, probably the most famous machine learning algorithms today are deep neural networks or deep learning. And let me just give you an example of the power of deep learning. And this is already an old story, but it goes to show the importance of doing basic research as well. So this is the chart of speech recognition and the word error rate. And you can see that in the very beginning, when we started doing research in speech recognition, in the 90s, we didn't do so well. But after a while, around 1999, we had a marked drop in the word error rate. And it basically said 25%. So that basically says 1 in 4 words as you're uttering, as you're speaking, the machine is hearing and recognizing your words, and every 4th word it doesn't recognize correctly. That's not acceptable if you're trying to talk to a machine. If you're trying to talk to a machine that's at the other end, you're on the telephone, the other machine, every 4th word you speak, it doesn't understand. That's not acceptable. But you can see that the research community plateaued for many years. We were stuck. We were basically using hidden Markov models. We were stuck. We couldn't make any break. We couldn't do any better. We couldn't do any better until circa 2009. And that's when we used deep neural networks for the speech recognition task. And you can see we dropped the word error rate to 15%, which is much more acceptable, 1 in every 6th word. And then later, by 2011, 2012, we were below 10%, which is much more acceptable. And this is the example of a deep neural network. I won't go into the details. You've heard these words before. But what was really the breakthrough for the community was a demo that my former boss at Microsoft Research, Rick Rashid, gave in China in 2012. He spoke English on the stage, and then in real time, that English was transcribed into text. That text was translated into Chinese text. That Chinese text was then uttered by a voice synthesizer in Rick's voice. And in real time, the Chinese students in the audience heard Rick speak in Chinese. And it was amazing. I was actually in the audience. I was not quite at Microsoft yet. I was sitting next to Daniela Roos, who runs the computer science AI lab at MIT, and I looked at her, and her jaw dropped. We were witnessing history. And then I looked behind me, and all the Chinese students there were tears in their eyes, because this is really breaking down language barriers. This, of course, was just a demo. And it was, of course, I can tell you all sorts of funny things. Like the night before, Rick was saying he did the demo, and he said, "Okay, I know not to say that word." But in any case, it was a demo, and it worked, and it was very impressive. And of course, Microsoft took that and ran with it. It is now in Skype Translator. It doesn't support all the language. It probably doesn't support Swedish, I'm sorry. But it does support Chinese and German and Spanish and some other languages. And so what happens is you can have a Skype phone call with someone speaking a different language. And in real time, you can have a conversation. What happens is as you're speaking, there's actually a transcript recognizing your speech, a transcript of what you're saying. And then in real time, we do the translation. And so the other person can then hear the translated text or just read it. And now what's so amazing is already a year ago, the word error rate dropped so dramatically that now machines can achieve human parity in conversational speech recognition. So this is all due to deep learning. This is amazing. This also goes to show that in just a few years, technology can advance so greatly that it's actually very hard to keep up with the advances. And this is a year old already. I'm told that now we can beat human level performance. So, but these are, now, to be honest, this is a specific data set. It's always, a lot of qualifiers to this. It still makes great news articles, though. Okay, so I need to move on because it's 10 o'clock already. I'm going to skip all this just to say that it's applicable for all fields because I want to get to the education part, and I'm going to skip my anthropology example. I will go through this example because many of you might have seen it, and this is why I think computational thinking is not such a foreign idea, because we use it in our daily lives, or we could. So this is me at the National Science Foundation cafeteria, my second day. I'm getting coffee, and I get a cup, and then I put some milk in it, and I get some coffee, and then I put some sugar in, and then I get a lid, and then a napkin, and then I leave. So as a computational thinker, what do I think when I see that coffee station? What do I think? I think how inefficient. I think how inefficient. I'm always looking for things, making things more efficient. And it's even worse, that's my path. It's even worse when there's someone in your way. You're trying to get your lid, and he's getting his cup. It's like, ah! So how would I solve this problem as a computational thinker? What do I think? I think pipelining. And so and then actually I'm giving you enough time to think, how am I going to affect a pipeline here? And there's another variation of, like, what are the minimum number of stations I need to move in order to affect a pipeline? Does that give me the most efficient pipeline? Blah, 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 blah. I haven't told you enough. I haven't told you that the soda and the coffee machines are bolted into the counter, so you can't move those. Okay, but anyway, the answer is you just need to move the lids over, and then you have a nice pipeline. I went to the cashier at the National Science Foundation cafeteria. I said, I know how to make your coffee station more efficient. You just move your lids over there, and all your customers will be much happier. And of course, he's staring at me. Doesn't know what I'm talking about. It's only my second day, but I had much more influence at the National Science Foundation in terms of computational thinking than moving the lids in the cafeteria. Okay, so now let's get to education. I think it was really, really good that Frederick set this question up. What is an effective way of learning or teaching computational thinking by K through 12 students? And there are really two parts of this. One is the toughest question. What concepts can students best learn when? And my analogy is to mathematics. We somehow know in mathematics that by the time you're 5 years old, you have some concept of number. You understand the concept of greater than. By the time you're 12 years old, you have enough mathematical sophistication to learn algebra. And by the time you're 18 years old, you have enough mathematical sophistication to learn calculus. We've somehow figured this out over centuries of teaching mathematics, and lots of trial and error. But we somehow figured that out. The question is, what about computer science? When is the right time to teach recursion? I remember when I first learned recursion, I think I was too young to learn it. I remember writing down the definition and kind of looking at it and staring at it. I don't think I really understood it. I was learning Snowball at the time, which is inherently lots of recursion. And I think I didn't come to appreciate recursion until I learned lambda calculus, basically, when I was in college. I didn't really understand recursion. So maybe I was a dummy. But maybe some kids can learn recursion when they're 5 years old. I don't know, or maybe 12 years old, or maybe it does take it when you're 18. I don't really know. I'm a computer scientist. I don't know how. This is where this interaction between computer scientists and people who understand how children learn, and education scientists and cognitive scientists and pedagogy scientists, whatever you want to call them, learning scientists, need to come together. Computer scientists have no clue about how children learn and at what age do they know anything, right? So we can make things up, but we wouldn't know any better. And this is why it's so important that this community is so coordinated and integrated in that way. so that's one question. One could argue when you're learning long division, and I think most in the U.S. I think we usually teach long division in what's called fourth grade. So that's 9-year-olds. I don't know what it is in Sweden. When do you learn long division in Sweden? How old are you usually? Around 8 or 9 or 10 maybe. When you learn long division, at least when I learned long division, we learned an algorithm. We learned how to divide one number into another number to get the quotient and remainder. We even learned how to check our answer, right? That was kind of part of learning the algorithm. But never did my teacher ever utter the word algorithm. Now, when I look back, I thought, is that a lost opportunity? Could I be learning what an algorithm is when I'm just 9 years old? And if I am empowered with that concept of an algorithm, maybe I'll come up with a different way of doing long division, my own algorithm to do long division. And I'll have a different way of checking my answer than the one I'm taught. And I do remember the next year, I was 10 years old, I guess, learning some other concept, and something hit me. Probably it was what I would call an algorithm today, of doing something differently from the way my teacher taught me. And I was so excited. I didn't know how to explain what I just thought of. But I knew it was a different way of answering that problem. Anyway, I had personal excitement, but I still remember that idea. And I think it really was that I figured out an algorithm on my own. And I just wonder, children probably do that without our even knowing it. Why don't we give them that, empower them with that concept, and then once they have that concept, they'll invent new algorithms everywhere, every time, all the time. Okay, the second big question you alluded to also, Frederick, is how do we actually integrate the computer with learning the concepts? This is the problem that we should avoid, is throwing technology into the classroom. Because we don't know whether that's effective in terms of learning the concepts or not, or detrimental. So let's not just think, to teach computer science, we should give them computers. Or we should give them a login and password and a browser and, access to a computer. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's not to say computers don't have a role, technology doesn't have a role, but we need to be smart about it. Okay, I'm really over time. So let me just say, in the US, there are lots of efforts going on. We are not at all coordinated in the way that one can be in, say, Sweden, or certainly in the UK, which is where I want to get to. We do have a kind of grassroots efforts in major metropolitan areas that are trying to promote computational thinking or computer science education to K-12 students. You can see different metropolitan areas have different goals, but they're all on this now. This was not unheard of 10 years ago. This is a new one, Rhode Island now. This is probably the most gratifying. Of course, President Obama is no longer president, so what he said in 2016 makes no difference anymore. But what he did say is, in the coming years, in his State of the Union address, in the coming years, we should build on that progress by providing pre-K for all, offering every student the hands-on computer science and math classes that make them job ready on day one. For the word computer science to appear in a State of the Union address is a big deal. It's a big deal. And then NSF immediately funded $25 million for a computer science for all, with a commitment of $100 million for the next 4 years. So that was 2016 already. $100 million for the NSF is a lot of money, because its annual budget is still less than $1 billion. So this is a lot of money for just one initiative. Okay, so the UK is where I really want to tip my hat to the UK. And this really started with their report by the British Royal Society that argued the importance of computational thinking at school. This is your kind of school now, K through 12. And sure enough, starting September 2014 already, an entirely new K through 12 subject called computer science was introduced to their curriculum. And if how many of you are familiar with this? Okay, so that's good. You can just go to the website and look it up. There are a lot of other international efforts that I know about. There are probably others that are happening that I don't know about. But I'm already impressed by what's going on around the world here. And this, of course, leads me to the obvious, what's going on here. You've told me this conference is all about that, and I'm going to learn more as I sit through your talks. Let me just say that my 3-page article has been translated, not yet to Swedish, I believe, but to lots of other languages. I don't even recognize some of these anymore. Korean's up there, and Portuguese, and French, of course, Chinese. So let me stop and just say thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over your coffee break. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And I actually can answer a question regarding Sweden. So Sweden has a new curricula where programming is introduced from grade 1. Starting basically now, but has to be implemented starting next year. So you have to add Sweden to your list of countries which are introducing this.
But programming is a lot different than learning computer science, so keep that in mind.
Thank you. Please, Skolverket, can you note that down? Because that's what I've been arguing the whole time. So after listening to this talk, I think you get 2 messages. Why do an AI researcher like myself engage in these things? And secondly, why is computer science so important and maybe not programming? So, yeah. So let's have a few questions, even though we're a bit behind. So, Gabriel, did you have a microphone? Or, yeah. So, questions? There's no questions. So that means that either no one understood anything or everything is absolutely clear.
No, this is not right.
You can just hold it in your hand.
Okay, here.
Yes, Judy. Oh, yeah.
I can hear you, or I can repeat your question.
Thank you. So you talked about computational thinking as thought processes, and you also mentioned your experience with learning recursion. And one thing that sort of came to my mind now was that. And also the long division. So there are explicit algorithms, but then there might be implicit algorithms, or maybe like sorting or something. Children can do sorting. So I would like to ask you what you think about the actually being able to explicitly describe an algorithm versus understanding or sort of coming up with an algorithm, even though you can't express it.
Okay, so let me see. Let's see. The question is, let's state your question again.
In a shorter form.
Is it necessary to be able to explicitly describe your algorithm to do computational thinking, or can a child do computational thinking without being able to explicitly state the algorithm?
I think there's a difference between the execution of an algorithm. I think what you're saying is there's a difference between the execution of an algorithm, which you're just doing naturally, versus writing down what you're doing. And I think that this, again, is something that is probably important to figure out what makes sense for what a child needs to be able to do at what age. So I do think eventually every child should be able to explicitly describe an algorithm, whether it's sorting or doing long division or finding the shortest path from home to school. I think students easily, I mean, it doesn't have to be a step-by-step depending on your age, it doesn't necessarily have to be step by step in a way that a computer can then execute. But it could be a pseudocode, if you will. Although eventually, I think certainly by junior high, students can be writing code and explicitly running the algorithm. But the point you were making before, that kind of implicitly, the fact that you look at that cafeteria and you're not going to say, oh, pipelining it's sort of a concept, and I'm not using an algorithm to affect a pipeline. It's just a concept, much like recursion is a concept. It's not an algorithm. Right, and I think those sorts of things are actually, some of them are inherent to us. But there are some things that we learn because our mommy and daddy taught us, and there's some things that we just pick up by naturally. And computer scientists have fancy names for these concepts. So is that cool? But that's fine. I don't think that. Isn't it great that we already are computational thinkers without our even knowing it? The point then is, if once we name that concept, and this is true no matter what field you're in, once you name a concept, that's very intellectually powering. So if you name that concept algorithm, then all of a sudden you get this general concept. Then you see, all of a sudden you see algorithms everywhere. Or you invent new algorithms. You name that concept recursion, and then you noodle on that idea, and actually when you kind of maybe write out the unfolding of a recursive function, you see what's going on, or you see how this equation, there's an f on one side and an f on the other side, and you think, oh, does that even make sense? You start puzzling over that. And that causes you to think deeper. And now we're talking mathematics at that point. So I do think that, I remember, this is my mom now. When I wrote that article, she read the article. My mother is hardly a technologist. She's not a computer scientist at all. She says, oh, what's the big deal, Jeannette? I think computationally. It's like, okay. That's great, Mom. So this is not meant to be intimidating in any way. It's not meant to, like, you need to, 14 years of schooling before you can be a computational thinker. No, you might need 14 years of schooling before you become a computer scientist. But that doesn't mean that you can't start thinking like a computer scientist with some natural things that we do or understand. Does that help? Yeah.
Okay, so if you have more questions, I think you have to take it in a break. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.